Okay, let's unpack this. We got a request for a deep dive into, well, quite a stack of sources,
Hmm.
actually. And they seem to reveal a global trend that's maybe happening a bit under the radar for most people. Definitely not Silicon Valley this time.
No, not at all.
Hmm.
This is about China's rapidly growing presence in Africa. And the sources you share, they make it really clear this isn't just about economic investment.
Although that's a big part, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
But there's a significant strategic and, yes, military dimension at play here, too.
Yeah.
The research, it really describes it as a profound, often sort of unheralded transformation of the continent.
That sounds fascinating. Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to really get to the core of what this research is telling us. We're basically going to act as your guides through this material.
Yeah, pull out the key insights.
Exactly. Pull out the most important nuggets from the sources you've shared, help you understand, what really matters here, quickly get to the heart of it.
And what jumped out at me right away from these sources is how they frame China's approach. They call it a meticulously planned, multi-layered strategy, something far exceeding just economic partnership.
Wow, okay.
They even use phrases like a potential hidden empire.
A hidden empire. That's powerful language. And the geography covered here is huge, isn't it?
It's massive. You're looking at everything from Djibouti over on the East Coast,
Mhm.
across to Equatorial Guinea on the Atlantic West, and they touch on places like Tanzania, Angola, Namibia, too. It's continent-wide, really.
Okay. So let's maybe start with the big picture they paint. This silent dragon strategy you mentioned.
Right, the silent dragon.
Yeah.
The basic idea presented is that all the highly visible stuff, the new ports, the roads, the railways, all those big infrastructure projects.
The stuff you see on the news sometimes.
Exactly. That's just the surface layer. But beneath that, they argue there's a deep strategic foundation being laid right across the continent.
And the scope is just immense. Thousands of kilometers of coastline linking up key regions. So the sources seem to pose this central question, right?
Mm.
Is all this activity just about, say, protecting China's trade, their investments in Africa, which are huge, obviously, or is there something deeper, a kind of geopolitical gambit that's maybe less obvious?
And look, these sources, they don't really hold back on their conclusion. They argue pretty emphatically, actually, that these actions are absolutely integral to a grand strategy.
Okay. A strategy to do what, exactly?
Well, they say it's explicitly designed to fundamentally alter global trade arteries,
Uh,
recalibrate military power balances, and directly challenge the long-standing Western-dominated world order, as they put it.
wow.
They believe what's happening in Africa is going to be instrumental in determining who controls the planet's vital sea lanes in the coming decades.
Okay, so that's the big claim. Where do the sources say this grand strategy first becomes, undeniable? Where's the clearest signal?
They point straight to Djibouti. That's seen as the vanguard.
Djibouti, okay. In the Horn of Africa.
Right, that's where China's overt military footprint first appeared. Back in 2017, they officially inaugurated their first ever overseas military base there. They call it the Plan Support Base,
Yep.
Pika's Liberation Army Navy.
Planned support base, got it. And Djibouti's location. Why is that so critical?
Oh, it's hugely significant, geopolitically speaking. It's strategically perched right near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Okay.
And the sources really highlight this. It's one of the world's most vital maritime choke points. Think about it. Something like 10% of global trade.
10%. Wow.
Yeah, massive amounts of oil, goods, everything. It flows daily from the Indian Ocean through that narrow strait up into the Red Sea
Yeah.
and then towards the Suez Canal in Europe.
So having influence there, that's enormous leverage.
Massive leverage on a global scale, yeah. And the base itself, it's not just some small docking station, is it?
That's what I was wondering. What do the sources say it looks like?
They describe something far more substantial based on satellite imagery, intelligence assessments cited in the material. It's apparently a sprawling facility, heavily fortified.
Fortified how?
It includes things like underground bunkers, extensive logistical facilities, and, critically, a deep water port. One specifically designed to handle large naval vessels.
Large, aircraft carriers.
The sources specifically mention its capacity to potentially berth aircraft carriers, yes.
Yeah.
And the consistent presence of Chinese military personnel suggests it's fully operational now.
And here's where it gets really interesting, at least from the source's perspective, how close it is to other major powers' bases.
Right. That detail is quite striking. This new Chinese base, it's located just a few kilometers away from existing military installations run by the U.S. Camp Lemonnier.
Right, I've heard of that one.
And France and Japan also have bases nearby. The sources, they actually describe this concentration turning Djibouti into a, quote, high-tension zone.
High-tension zone.
Yeah, calling it a microcosm of global geopolitical rivalries. Almost like reminiscent of the Cold War era, but packed into this tiny area.
So this base isn't just about logistics for their ships sailing by. The sources see it as a much bigger statement.
Exactly. It's presented as a clear declaration, a declaration of China's global military ambitions, and a very tangible step in their intent to project power far beyond their own shores, especially into this absolutely critical maritime region.
Okay, so that covers the East Coast, Djibouti, where the military presence is very overt. What about the other side? What did the sources tell us about China's strategic picture on Africa's Atlantic coast? They mentioned Equatorial Guinea.
Yes, moving westward. Equatorial Guinea is highlighted as a crucial node in this potential network.
And the big advantage there, I guess, is
direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. That's the key strategic advantage it offers. And the specific focal point they discuss is the port city of Baka.
Bata. Now, this port is, on the surface, commercial, isn't it? But the sources seem to cite some pretty serious intelligence suggesting otherwise.
That's right. They reference things like leaked intelligence reports, U.S. defense assessments, which strongly suggest China has or had concrete plans to convert Bata, or at least significant parts of it, into a naval-based facility.
Okay, hang on. A Chinese naval base on the Atlantic coast. That sounds huge.
It would be monumental, according to these sources. Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Up until now, China's naval power projection, it's been primarily focused, Pacific, Indian Oceans, generally closer to home.
Right.
An active naval facility in Bata would basically shatter those geographical limits.
Yeah.
It would grant the plan direct, sustained access to the Atlantic. And that's a maritime domain historically dominated by the U.S. and NATO powers.
So from Bata, they could potentially project power into the Western Hemisphere. Is that the idea?
That's precisely the concern highlighted in the assessments, yes. From a base in Bata, the sources say the Chinese Navy would gain the capability not just to monitor maritime traffic along West Africa, but also extend its operational reach towards South America. And significantly, even towards the eastern seaboard of the United States.
Wow. Okay. So this port, it could be used for what? Refueling, resupply, repairs, allowing them to keep ships operating far from Asia for longer periods.
Exactly. According to the assessment cited, it would significantly enhance their operational endurance, their reach right across the Atlantic. The sources, they frame this potential development as nothing short of a monumental leap in China's global power projection capabilities.
It's probably not surprising, then, that this has caused some alarm bells to ring.
Considerable alarm, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in Washington. The sources mention U.S. officials reportedly describing a potential Chinese base in Equatorial Guinea as a significant national security threat.
Because it would be the first.
It would mark the first time a rival superpower established a significant, potentially hostile military presence in a region the U.S. has, for decades, considered its sphere of influence, more or less.
So this potential move in Equatorial Guinea, it isn't just about expansion. It's seen as a really bold geopolitical message, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's presented as a direct challenge, a challenge to the established naval dynamics of oceans that have traditionally been seen as largely under American or NATO control.
Okay, so beyond the overt base in Djibouti and this potential future base in Equatorial Guinea, the sources bring up another key concept, this dual-use doctrine.
Ah, yes, dual use.
This seems to be where the economic stuff subtly paves the way for military use, right?
That's exactly what's so insightful about this part of the analysis, I think. It's a less visible approach, more gradual. They use Gabon and Angola, both on the West African coast, as prime examples.
Okay, Gabon first. What's happening there?
So in Gabon, there isn't an overt base. Not yet, anyway. But China is heavily engaged economically, big trade deals, and the sources point to discrete military cooperation agreements happening alongside all that economic activity.
They mentioned Gabon was upgraded diplomatically, didn't they? A comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership in April 2023.
Yes, exactly. And the sources suggest that this kind of, diplomatic language often acts as a sort of veil, a veil for deeper engagements, possibly including undisclosed military understandings.
Okay.
The argument is that these economically focused partnerships are specifically designed, perhaps, to gradually transition into more explicit security arrangements down the line. It fits what the sources describe as China's typical MO.
Which is?
Economic penetration first, fostering dependency, and then incrementally expanding their security and military influence.
And Angola is presented as a place where this dual-use strategy is maybe already more evident.
Right. Angola is a really good example in the sources. It's strategically located on the southwestern coast, very resource-rich, and China has become absolutely central to its economy.
How central?
Well, its largest trading partner since 2007, its largest creditor, a crucial political supporter. They've poured billions into oil, construction, and here's the key part, critical port infrastructure. Like the major modernization of the port of Luanda, which was carried out by Chinese state-owned companies.
Right. And the sources argue that the design of ports like Luanda is crucial for understanding this dual-use idea.
Yes. The research really highlights that these Chinese-funded port upgrades, they aren't just designed for container ships or tankers. They're often built with, let's say, enhanced capabilities.
Like what?
Deeper berths, more advanced logistics systems, heavier cranage, things that are also characteristic of facilities needed to accommodate large naval vessels.
Ah, okay.
So while they function commercially day to day, their design means they could be rapidly converted or utilized as forward military facilities if China needed them for support.
So from Luanda, China could potentially support warships, maybe even submarines, operating in the South Atlantic.
That's the potential that the sources outline. By investing so heavily and effectively having significant influence over such critical infrastructure, China basically creates strategic options for itself.
And more options mean more power, geopolitically speaking.
That's usually how it works, yes.
Okay, let's swing back to the East Coast for a second. Because China isn't just building new relationships. The sources show they're also reinforcing and leveraging older ones. They use Tanzania as a key example of this long-term cultivation.
Yeah, Tanzania is a fascinating case. The relationship there, it goes way back to the Cold War era, the 1960s, 70s.
Right.
The iconic Tazara Railway, that massive 860-kilometer line built with some significant Chinese aid.
To give Zambia access to the sea, right, through Dar es Salaam.
Exactly. That's highlighted as a really early, very visible example of China building soft power, building influence across the continent decades ago.
And the research shows they're basically applying that same kind of strategy today, but maybe on an even bigger scale.
Absolutely. There's heavy current investment in Tanzania's ports, roads, energy sector. And the most ambitious plan discussed, at least in these sources, was the proposed Bagamoyo Port project.
Bagamoyo, where's that?
Just north of Dar es Salaam, it was envisioned as potentially Africa's largest port.
Africa's largest. Wow. A multi-billion-dollar project planned by Chinese companies, I assume.
Correct. And crucially, the sources note that its planned capacity, its design, it was such that it could have very easily handled significant military hardware and served as a major logistics hub for naval vessels operating out in the Indian Ocean.
And this seems important. And the sources note a hiccup with Bagamoyo. The project got stalled.
Yes, reportedly stalled or suspended by the Tanzanian government.
Why?
The reason cited in the research was concerns raised by Tanzania over potentially unfavorable terms in the deal, terms that they felt could compromise their national sovereignty.
Okay.
And the sources actually call this kind of pushback over contract terms on these massive projects a recurring theme in some of the big Chinese infrastructure deals across Africa.
Interesting. But despite that specific project hitting a snag, the sources suggest China's broader strategic interest in Tanzania hasn't really gone away, right?
Not at all. No. They point to robust, ongoing military cooperation, things like joint exercises. China's also funded military academies and training centers in Tanzania.
Which embeds their influence over the long term.
Exactly. Within the country's defense establishment. And from a purely naval strategy perspective, Tanzania offers a critical asset.
Its coastline?
Its extensive Indian Ocean coastline, yeah. It's optimal for expanding naval presence beyond just the base in Djibouti. A significant presence there, or even just reliable access points, would allow China to monitor, maybe influence, shipping routes not just in East Africa, but further out towards Southeast Asia, across the whole Indian Ocean basin.
So the argument in the sources seems to be, even if there isn't an official Chinese base in Tanzania right now, the sheer weight of their economic influence, their control over infrastructure, the deep relationships they've built, It makes it very difficult for a country like Tanzania to say no if China decides it needs strategic access or support in the future.
That's the core of their point, precisely. China's approach, it isn't always about planting a flag on a new base. Sometimes it's about building such deep dependency and influence that strategic access becomes, well, almost guaranteed if and when they decide they need it. It's a very powerful, subtle form of leverage.
Okay, so to complete this picture of China's growing coastal network, the sources then take us south, specifically looking at Namibia. This seems to be a focus since around 2018 or so.
Yeah, Namibia. On the southwestern coast, it offers two key things strategically, according to the sources. One is direct access to the South Atlantic Ocean,
Okay.
and the other is a relatively stable political environment, at least compared to some other nations in the region. And the focus there is the port of Walvis Bay.
Walvis Bay, that's the main deepwater harbor there, isn't it?
It is. It's the primary one. And there's been significant Chinese investment there, too.
How significant?
Hundreds of millions over the last couple of decades. There was a major upgrade contract worth about $260 million back around 2012, awarded to a Chinese state-owned construction company to modernize and expand the port facilities.
And let me guess, the sources see that familiar dual-use design philosophy playing out again.
You guessed it. Exactly. They argue the enhanced facilities at Walvis Bay, the deeper berths, the advanced logistics capabilities, they're characteristic of what's needed for naval support operations.
Right.
The contention is, again, if the geopolitical situation demanded it, Walvis Bay could be pretty rapidly transformed, or at least utilized, as a functional naval support point for operations deep in the South Atlantic.
So what are the strategic implications when you put Walvis Bay together with the potential, naval utility of Angola's Luanda port, which we talked about earlier, both on that southwestern coast?
That's where the sources see a really significant strategic convergence. If China secures reliable naval access or support capabilities at both Walvis Bay in Namibia and Luanda in Angola, that would give them a remarkable degree of control, or at least influence, over a huge swath of Africa's western and southern coastline.
This really starts to look like a formidable chain of access points.
It really does. The sources, they describe it as a potential network, stretching all the way from the overt base in Djibouti up in the northeast, potentially through facilitated access in Tanzania on the east coast, curving all the way around southern Africa via Namibia and Angola on the Atlantic side, and then reaching up towards Equatorial Guinea, maybe Gabon, in west central Africa. It's vast.
And what does having a network like that actually allow China to do, according to this research?
Well, the sources argue it puts China in an almost unparalleled position, a position to monitor, to influence, maybe even interfere with maritime traffic coming from or going to crucial regions like Latin America, Southern Europe, the resource-rich Gulf of Guinea.
Right.
And crucially, it allows them to project naval power and sustain significant operations across these vast oceanic areas without having to rely solely on bases way back in Asia.
So these ports, ultimately, they're not just about shipping containers or exporting resources.
Not according to this analysis, no. The sources describe ports like Walvis Bay and Luanda less as simple commercial assets and more as critical strategic pieces on the global chessboard.
Okay.
Carefully positioned, poised to become powerful assets, granting China significant maneuverability and control over key maritime territories, like queens on the board, as one source put it.
Right. Okay, so we've explored what China seems to be doing on the coasts of Africa and where. Now let's dig into the why. According to the sources you shared, what are the core motivations driving this incredibly expensive, very expansive strategy?
The sources, they really identify three main interconnected motivations behind this whole approach. First, and maybe the most immediate one, is the protection of vast economic interests.
Okay, that makes sense. China's invested, hundreds of billions across Africa, Belt and Road Initiative, all that.
Exactly. Massive projects, roads, railways, ports, mining, telecoms, you name it. And Africa is absolutely vital for China's economy. As a source of raw materials, yes, but also as a growing market for its goods.
But it can be a volatile place.
That's the issue. Many parts of the continent face significant volatility, unstable governments, corruption risk, sometimes civil unrest, even terrorism. This poses a direct risk to China's enormous investments.
And there are people working there.
Yes, importantly, to the safety of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals working on these projects. So the sources explain that having military facilities, or at least reliable access points nearby, gives them the capability for rapid deployment.
To protect assets or evacuate people if things go bad?
Precisely. A capability that would be incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to mount effectively just from bases way back in Asia. So that's number one.
Okay, protecting the economic footprint makes sense. What's the second motivation identified?
The second big one is global power projection. China has very explicit aspirations to be a true global superpower,
Like the U.S.
capable of projecting military influence anywhere in the world, much like the U.S. has done for decades, yes. For years, the U.S. Navy has held, pretty much unparalleled dominance, effectively controlling key global sea lanes. The sources argue China is now directly seeking to first emulate and then challenge that dominance.
And this network they seem to be building in Africa is central to achieving that goal.
Absolutely central. By establishing these bases and access points on both Africa's eastern and western coasts, China aims to exert significant influence, maybe even eventual control over both the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans.
Right.
This network, it enables them to conduct sustained naval patrols, provide the necessary resupply for those patrols, and essentially demonstrate their power across huge distances, from the Persian Gulf potentially all the way to South America, achieving what the sources call genuine global reach.
Okay. So protecting investments, global power projection. What's the third major driver the sources point to?
The third one is direct competition with existing powers. Africa, as we know, has long been an arena where other global powers maintain a military or strategic presence.
We mentioned the U.S. base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier.
Right, they're largest in Africa. France still has bases from its colonial past. Even Japan has an outpost in Djibouti.
So the thinking in Beijing, according to these sources, is sort of like, if they're all there with military assets, why shouldn't we be? Especially given our massive and growing economic and political stake on the continent.
That's precisely how the sources frame it. It's about sending a clear message, a message that China is no longer willing to just passively accept a global order that's primarily dictated by Western powers.
They want a seat at the table.
They demand a seat at the main table, yes. And increasingly, it seems, they're seeking to establish their own table, maybe with their own rules. And Africa is a key place where they are demonstrating this new capability, this new intent.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together then. The sources you've provided, they really seem to argue that what's unfolding in Africa isn't just, a collection of isolated projects or some regional developments. They think it signifies something much bigger.
Yeah, they believe it signifies a truly fundamental redefinition of the global balance of power.
That's a huge claim.
It is. But that's the major takeaway they want you to understand. The research suggests China is systematically, strategically altering the long-standing Western, particularly U.S. influence right across the African continent. And perhaps remarkably, they're achieving this, as the sources put it, largely without firing a single shot.
So the argument is that each new port, each new road, each partnership, it's not just an economic deal in isolation. It's actually a building block for a new kind of world order.
Exactly. An order where power is maybe more diffuse, more multipolar.
Yeah.
Where Beijing is rapidly becoming a central global node, actively competing with Washington, with Brussels, for influence. The sources conclude that Africa, which maybe external powers viewed differently in the past, perhaps as mere peripheral, is rapidly transforming into a, quote, primary battleground for 21st century superpower competition.
Wow. So the future of the continent itself, and maybe the contours of global influence for decades to come, are being shaped right now by this silent but relentless advance, as the sources describe it.
They paint a picture of the world witnessing the rise of a multipolar era. And in many ways, they see Africa as becoming its crucible, the place where it's forged.
Right.
The long-term consequences of what they call China's hidden military empire will, in their view anyway, be profound. With the influence of the dragon's breath, as one source poetically put it, felt across oceans and continents.
Okay, wow. That was certainly a deep dive into a fascinating and honestly quite a startling picture painted by these sources we looked at. They really argue that China is strategically leveraging its massive economic ties, its infrastructure development across Africa to quietly but very effectively build this significant multi-layered military and strategic footprint. It's clearly portrayed as far more than just trade. It seems to be about power projection, securing vital interests, and directly challenging the existing global order.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the profound implications this could have for global trade routes, for the future dynamics of international relations, for the power balance between the major world players.
Yeah.
How might this developing network of ports and access points fundamentally change things we maybe just take for granted about global access and influence?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe here's something else to mull over, something that struck me based on how the sources describe this strategy as being largely hidden or silent, happening beneath the surface of all the visible development. It just makes you wonder what other significant global shifts might be occurring right now, maybe through similar, less obvious means, reshaping the world in ways we don't fully appreciate or perhaps don't even really see yet.